So this gives me some time for the introduction, which is going to be very, very short because we don't have much time. At about 3 o'clock, Camille and Bruno have to leave for the airport for their afternoon flight. So we have to get this discussion finished by then. Also, we have with us 4 speakers, participants in this debate, and all of them should have enough time to express their opinion on the topic before us, which is do norms deter? Emily?
I'm looking for Bruno.
Me too.
Downstairs?
Bruno's downstairs. In fact, I prepared several topics for discussion, questions actually, and I shared these ideas with the speakers so that they can prepare themselves, and Bruno was the only one who said that he doesn't want to know in advance what I'm going to ask him, and that he would rather leave it as a surprise. So he's
surprising.
He's surprising us, and but it's okay. With us, Camille Grand. You know him already after a day and a half together. I will just mention that he has been the director of FRS in France. Bruno Tertrais is a senior research fellow at the same foundation. Hi, Bruno.
Sorry, I keep forgetting that Israelis are always on time, and that's
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's because of your flight that we're here on time. Cameron Brown. I'm sure you met him already. He's a Neubauer Research Fellow at INSS. And Dr. Amir Lupovici, to my left, is a lecturer, assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Tel Aviv University. And as you were told, you have the full biographies of our participants in this very beautiful booklet with the program of this conference. So, to our debate, and I have to admit that at the first glance, I had to realize that the topic is not so simple, it's rather philosophical. We have to deal with the issue of norms, and it's quite an elusive concept. I'm sure you noticed that the issue of what goes beyond treaties, beyond legally binding rules of the game and formal regimes, you notice that these issues were at least at the subtext of some of the presentations that you heard since yesterday. What we will try to do is to somehow isolate the issue of norms from the range of what direct people's states' behavior with regard to proliferation and non-proliferation. And we will not go into specific with regard to deterring what? Development, acquisition, manufacturing, or use of nuclear weapons. We will deal with the issue of deterrence and norms in general, but of course the speakers are free to use practical, actual instances as they like, if they want to make their opinions clear to the audience. And I think it's better that we start with basic question. Basically, we will discuss the issue under 2 headings. One is What do we mean by norms? What's the nature and main features of norms? The other heading is the role of norms, how they act to direct behavior of states. And with your permission, I will address the first question, which is what comes first, norms or treaties? Do treaties reflect established norms, or is it the other way around? And international law that over time, it is the international law that over time establishes norms of binding significance. And this question is addressed to Camille Grand. Camille, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you for that. I think it's an interesting debate, because of course it can be a very sort of theoretical debate, but it also has very direct policy implications. So if we take norm in the sort of broader sense, more what the political science would call a regime theory versus a narrow legal meaning. So we can have this debate on whether norms precede or derive from treaties. Of course, it's a bit of a chicken and egg debate in many ways, because you can argue, I'll take two examples to make that point. One is to say that I guess many, from a regime perspective, many in Israel would argue that Israel abides the non-proliferation regime. Of course, from a treaty perspective, not being a party to the NPT would be a slight difference from that. So you can immediately see the difference between a sort of broad policy of going by the norm, which is not spreading nuclear technology to others, accepting a few principles that go within the regime, and treaty enforcement per se. I'll take another example, which I think is interesting, because it's the typical chicken and egg thing. It's the cluster bomb issue. The cluster bomb process, which led to the Oslo Convention, started from a norm, which was humanitarian law and humanitarian, the principle of international humanitarian law, that you don't do unnecessary harm at war. So based on that, there was this humanitarian campaign to derive from that broader norm a specific treaty which would ban, in theory, cluster bombs, in practice, specific types of cluster bombs. And of course, the creation of that treaty creates a new norm, because then the use of cluster bomb becomes, if not illegal for non-signatories, at least more difficult to justify. And NGOs would argue that based on the Ottawa Convention on Landmines precedent, at a certain point, landmines are de facto pretty well prohibited. So you've established a norm beyond the signatories of the treaty. So you do have a sort of circular moment there for that. And what is interesting is that, in a way, norms do sometimes deter better than treaties. What I mean by that, and it's very interesting, for instance, if you go through the reading of Bertrand Goldschmidt, who used to be our director for international affairs in the French Atomic Energy Commission in the 60s, he writes very clearly that in those days, proliferation was acceptable. And that was not an issue. When in the 50s and early 60s, it was not a problem. And what is interesting is how the build-up of the regime, including, of course, the NPT, has suddenly made it impossible for any country to genuinely either make the case for its own proliferation or to make the case for others' proliferation, therefore cornering the countries either into a rogue position, the sort of DPRK case, or into countries that do lie about what they're doing and pretend they abide the norm, and the treaties, even though they are not. So we see that there is a very strong connection between the treaty and the norms per se. But what is interesting is when the norm establishes a taboo that goes beyond the treaties. And one last example, is the issue of chemical weapon use, for instance. One of the reasons the Syrian issue was, in my view, so important is that the taboo was shaken for the first time in 25 years, for only a handful of cases since 1925. And one regret I had is that there was a rather soft norm from the Geneva Protocol that was not pushed forward so much at the time, which I think was in a way stronger than the Chemical Weapon Convention norm, which from a treaty perspective is of course much stronger because it is a treaty that bans and so on. But of course, when you're talking about the CWC, you're saying, but it's not a signatory, therefore we don't have an issue. With the Geneva Protocol, you have something that is part of Jus Cogens, and that has a much broader application and is assumed to be part of customary international law in many ways, and therefore is really part of a broader norm to say that you should not use chemical and biological weapons, and the only people that have done that are Bashar al-Assad, Mussolini, and a handful of others, but Saddam Hussein, and so you're in good company if you do that. So I think this is where I would sort of play on the treaty norm distinction.
Thank you, Camille. Yes, Cameron, I want to ask you, so this will give you a chance to comment on what Camille just said. I wanted to ask you, with regard to how do normatively based rules of the game work, connecting to what Camille said about norms sometimes working better or they are more influential than treaties. I wanted to ask you in what way treaties bind or could in the future bind states that are not participants in certain regimes or legal treaties, with a focus on the how, beyond the principle.
So let me just first get a two-finger into what Camille has spoken about. And when I've looked at norms, and I'm trying to think about the norms I know that have manifestation in international law, what I see is some are chickens and some are eggs. So the territorial integrity norm really doesn't get generated and then end up in international law. It starts in international law. It's first found in the Covenant of the League of Nations in Article 10, and frankly is not exactly accepted by most of the countries in the world. Throughout the 1920s, countries don't exactly know, even countries who signed on to the Covenant and were part of the Executive Committee of the League of Nations, didn't really buy the norm at all. And what you see is that the norm comes after the treaty. There are plenty of examples, and WMD is another example. Chemical and biological weapons, one of the first times where we see that they're forbidden, right, is the Hague Convention in 1907. There's actually several instances before where there were treaties that didn't have the same standing, but there were beginnings of this even before. And these were before these weapons had really even been fully formed. This said, there are other examples where they're chickens. The human rights treaties, environmental treaties, these are treaties that come well after norms are on their way to being created, and when countries themselves have already developed legislation in many cases to deal with these problems. So that's just one quick thought. And what would be interesting maybe for future thinking about this is, why is it that some start out in one way and others are starting out from international treaties? About your question, how is it that a treaty could impact a non-signatory's behavior? Well, we just saw this, right? And one of the most fascinating cases and parts about the Syrian use of chemical weapons is it really, from a legal perspective, and Penina, who's an expert on international law, may disagree with me, but in my reading of it, wasn't really bound by international law. Because the Geneva Convention, which it had signed in 1925, is about interstate warfare and use about chemical weapons between states. In fact, at one point, the French and the Brits wanted to include tear gas in this. And what was the American response? The American response is, how could you forbid use of tear gas in war when we all agree that it should be used domestically? So the Geneva Convention was clearly not about what you do during a civil war. It was all about regulating interstate warfare. So they had signed that, but they had not signed the CWC. And yet, when they used chemical weapons against their own people, everyone jumped up and down. Again, I happen to agree with jumping up and down about the use of chemical weapons. Don't misunderstand me. But from a purely legal perspective, they could have claimed innocent because this just doesn't, it doesn't matter. I can clearly use this whenever I want. The Syrians never said legally we're not obliged to this, right? Which is different, by the way, than what the Pakistanis, Indians, and Israelis will say about the NPT. That's not what happened. In fact, also, same thing with Syria's backers. The Russians, the Iranians, nobody said, well, but it's okay, they haven't signed the CWC. Everyone thought it was a problem. In fact, such a great problem was it that they forced Syria to sign the CWC, which if Syria had been so interested in doing it, it would have done it before that. So I think it's a great example of how exactly these things happen. And that is the degree to which when you do see a norm that has been internalized deeply, it gets to the point where you just can't argue against it, right? And at that point, legalities don't save you. Norms, when the chemical weapons taboo first emerged, that wasn't the case. And there was a sense that you could, for instance, and one way that you can think about norms and the strength of a norm is it okay to retaliate in kind if the norm is broken? In World War II, there were clear threats by the Americans and by the British to retaliate in kind with chemical weapons should the Japanese or Germans use, and the threat was issued in response to Japanese use of chemical weapons in China in 1941. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, if you continue, we will unleash our entire chemical arsenal on you. That's not a very strong norm, right? That's not exactly what the United Nations told Syria, that they'll gas them to death if they continue to gas people. So it tells you something about the strength of the norm. And I think when you see a really strong norm, the legalities of it are no longer apply. So.
Thank you, Cameron. It was illuminating. And it leads us to the issue of deterrence, which is the question addressed to Amir, because when you use the chemical weapons example, we are talking about a case in which a state was induced to sign a treaty after it used it, the weapons, and this, of course, enraged the whole world practically. But there's an issue of how to prevent states from this first use of the weapon, even if it's not signatory to a treaty. And Amir will illuminate us regarding the issue of deterrence by norms, not by treaties, in international relations. Amir, please.
Thank you. First, I would like to say a few words about the question of what are norms and how should we study norms in international relations. So there's basically two ways of thinking of norms or studying norms. The first is from an ethical perspective, and in this respect, the question is whether a pattern of behavior is legitimate or moral. The second, which I would like to use it in my brief discussion, is from a sociological point of view. In this respect, the question is whether a pattern of behavior is spread or an idea is spread in the international arena and then is institutionalized and affect the behavior of different actors. So when I'm thinking of deterrence and norms, I can think of three main categories of the connections between these two concepts. The first is that deterrence is a practice that helps to preserve or maintain international norms. Think, for example, the norm of non-intervention in other countries, or the sovereignty, or norms like that, which are sustained and maintained by the threat of punishment, or extended deterrence or deterrence in case they are violated. The issue here is that, of course, the norm can be sustained even without the threat of punishment, as mentioned before, because of the learning of the idea that it is not right to do such a thing. But powerful actors may also deter the violation of this kind of behavior, especially, and this is, I think, one of the important points in this regard, deterrence is important in the early stages of the emergence of the norm. The second type of connection between deterrence and norm concern norms that affect the practices of deterrence. Here, the issue is that international norms shape the credibility or the likelihood that deterrence will fail or succeed. For example, the sensitivity to human rights, or the nuclear taboo, are norms that actors who have adopted them are more constrained in their ability to pose a credible deterrence threat, because the price they need to pay in cases that they violate, they need to execute the deterrence threat is higher comparing to a situation in which they haven't adopted this norm. I will give another example to this point. Many scholars, for example, argue that cyber deterrence is likely to fail because of the problem of anonymity. And the basic argument is that the difficulty of identifying with certainty the source of attack is a main challenge to pose a credible deterrence threat, because the protective challenger knows that the deterrent actor will be limited in its ability to execute a deterrence threat. I don't argue that this is not a problem, but it becomes a problem because of social norms that require actors to have a high degree of certainty in identifying the source of attack before they retaliate. So again, this is an example of how international norms affect the practices of deterrence. And lastly, and this is even more provocatively, deterrence itself can be seen as a norm that was spread in the international arena, and in which the idea that threatening an actor in order to dissuade it from using violence is legitimate, is the norm in the international arena. And in fact, in July 1996, the ICJ recognized the idea of the norm of deterrence in terms of it is a practice that many actors in the international arena recognize. So.
Well, right on time. I have a feeling that we are scratching the surface of this quite intriguing topic, but we have some time limitations. So I would like to take you back to questioning the nature of norms. After we talked about what are norms, how do they work, just mentioning, and how norms deter. And my question, actually my surprise to you, Bruno, is a question that goes like something like this. I mean, we tend to explain behavior in terms of norms quite extensively, but maybe what is perceived to be the result of the influence of norm or the impact of norm is actually a reflection of balance of power And when states avoid doing something that is likely to be punished or retributed in a way, is not just a demonstration of acceptance of norms, but rather fear of being punished for violating some rules.
It's a good question, but I think there can be a partial answer to that. When you have good historians looking extensively in archives, trying to understand what the domestic political debates at the highest level were on such or such particular issue, you can have partial answer to that question. You can't rely only on interviews, because sometimes people rationalize decisions to use or not use, to sign or not sign in a certain way. But when and where archives are available, it can give partial answers to your question. This is an issue that actually goes well beyond proliferation, disarmament, WMD issues. I think one of the most interesting debates today in contemporary international politics is how much, whether and how, and if yes, how much norms can help deter genocide and crimes against humanity. Do the establishment of 5 special tribunals since the end of the Cold War have an impact, a potential impact, a real impact on the behavior of state leaders? How much does the announcement that you will be put to trial for your crimes affect negatively behavior, in the sense that, oh, when I have nothing to lose, if I'm stigmatized by the international community, they tell me I'm going to The Hague, then I have nothing to lose. And it's a very interesting debate. I'm just saying that this debate about norms and deterrence is broader than this one. Chicken and eggs, connecting the two round tables, for me, the obvious egg, not the chicken at all, is nuclear weapons-free zones and WMD-free zone in the Middle East. All were the products of practice. The treaty arrived after the norm. And this is why, obviously, but we are all familiar with that, the idea that establishing a special case, WMD, not nuclear, in the Middle East, either you apply what has been taking place, you apply the same rezoning as has happened over the past 50 years, and you say it's impossible because the norm has to come. Or you treat it as a special case. But all nuclear weapons-free zones were established after the states in the regions had subscribed to the norm, in a sense. So the treaty came after the norm, so it was an egg. This is clearly an issue with where it was an egg. No, I mean, okay. But
I think Latin America would be, Tlatelolco would be an exception.
Okay, it's that process. No, it's not an exception in the sense that it was the other way around, but I accept the idea that it was a little bit of chicken and egg. It was a little bit of chicken and egg. But I would say that it's difficult to imagine a situation in this particular instance of non-proliferation where regional decisions were, of subscribing to a treaty was, before the norm, the political decision was established. Now, for me, the most striking example in this debate is the success of the NPT for as far as non-proliferation among Western liberal democracies is concerned. It is clear, and that's one of the rare issues where I completely agree with my friend Harl Müller, who's a strong defender of that thesis, but I completely agree with him. You cannot explain the success of the NPT among Western liberal democracies if you don't understand the power of the norm. That's pretty clear to me. It's all about, and then connecting again this debate to a previous debate of this morning, it's about reputation.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because it also worked for non-liberal countries. If you look at the history of the Shah's attitude towards nuclear weapons, the most powerful argument for him was, I want to be recognized as a Western country. Western countries actually do not proliferate. I want to please the Americans. I will not build nuclear weapons, at least for now. So this is an example where, through the norm, Iran was not deterred, but at least prevented from pursuing the nuclear weapons route. And even today, I mean, imagine if there was no NPT, no norm, and we would probably have had an Iranian, the trajectory of the Iranian nuclear program could very well have been different. The idea of a norm prevents Iran from openly doing things that it probably would have done otherwise. We all know that they want to have their cake and eat it. They want to project an image of a country that abides by the norm. So the norm is important to them, and the norm has concrete effects in terms of their behavior. So even for Iran, the norm matters. Now, when you look at another interesting example is nuclear experts. And then you have two different issues. You look at the behavior of France and China from 1968 onwards. Now, France clearly, for several years, claimed that it abided by the norm, but it did not completely. China did not at all. And it took China a long time. And what was the main reason why China stopped being an active in the sense of state control, nuclear proliferator? Because it was in its interest to abide by a norm to which the Americans attached great importance. They sacrificed non-proliferation on the altar of their good relation with the United States. That's also relevant to our debate about norms and deterrence. You don't want us to speak for too long, but as a coda, I would say
you have to leave.
No. We still have time, but this is interesting as a debate. I mean, and we can discuss indeed about Tlatelolco Treaty, whether it was an exception or not. It's an interesting debate.
Next year's conference.
We can discuss it now. The final point: the enforcement of the norm is critical, and I'm still of two minds about what history will learn from the crisis of September 2013, about the failed attempt by some countries to enforce the norm, the de facto norm on the non-use of chemical weapons. Whether it will be seen as something about, the story ends well since Syria doesn't have chemical weapons. Or, we didn't know, we suspected at the time, but the effect ended up being profound about the fact that, Western countries claim they enforce the norm, in fact they don't, etc. I don't know how history will judge it. It's a bit early to say, as Chu and I said about the French Revolution.
Thank you, Bruno, and thank you for connecting, the different issues that were mentioned in a question by saying something like it was in a state's interest to act according to a norm, which explains why differentiating norms from the legal dimension of...
Can I correct, just for the record?
Yeah.
I still think these are two different things. Interest and the way Western countries internalize a norm means that they don't operate only under realist principles.
Okay, not only, but
including.
Yeah. Thank you for the clarification. I want to move us forward. I will present an issue, and all of you will say what you think about it, and this will also give you a chance to reflect on each other's comments, and this will lead us hopefully to concluding this debate, which is quite short actually, on time. And the question is, in Hebrew we say, Shlav She'ela Zeha. Can you translate it for... I was thinking about arguments for judging each case of proliferation individually as a case and for itself. I mean, in other words, what reasons may, in certain cases, justify insubordination to internationally accepted normative or non-proliferation norms? What cases can be justified or understood or forgiven as opposed to others that are likely to create an international upheaval and a joint, collective, intense effort to bring violating state to complying with a norm? And maybe, Amir, you will be the first.
All started to write down their answers.
Yeah, you have time to prepare.
Well, I think I'll start with some comments regarding the big question, and I try to connect it of whether norms deter, and it alludes to, of course, to the speakers, to the previous speakers as well. But I think that norms, when they are internalized, they don't deter. That actors learn the behavior and they act appropriately.
There's
So
no
it's
need.
not
No
it's
longer
not
needs.
deterrence.
Yeah.
So,
No longer deterrence, yes.
but and I agree with that completely. But there's two mechanisms in which norms affect deterrence, as I tried to discuss earlier. First is that norms provide a context within which deterrence works or doesn't work. It affects the credibility of the deterrence threat. It provides it creates the interest of the actors and so on. And second, and there might be some sort of deterrence, in which is the self-deterrence of actors. And I mean by that policymakers may be deterred from the consequences of not following an international norms. And I mean by that they may experience negative public or international, negative public opinion internationally or domestically, which may deter them from doing certain types of activities. So in this sense, it might have deterrent effect, but it's not deterrence as we used to think of it in traditional ways of deterrence as the threat of missile attack or something like that. So this is a completely different mechanism of deterrence, but it can be seen as a deterrent effect of the.
Thank you, Amir. Cameron,
So,
please.
Sure. So first of all, I think you've asked a really interesting question. When can a norm violation be forgiven? And you put it in the context of weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, but I think it's it's a fantastic general question. And I think the one part of the answer is when a competing norm is at work. I'll give you two examples. To stick within proliferation, supposed Israeli proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, its obtaining of weapons of mass destruction. The reason why it's looked upon so forgivingly, especially in the United States, which has made non-proliferation a real issue, is, as Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld put it, there were countries that wanted to put Israel into the sea. It has figured out ways to make sure that it wasn't put into the sea. In other words, the right of self-defense, which is we can call it an even more superior norm than the norm against proliferation. There were those who understood that Israel had a right of self-defense and that this was the ultimate guarantee, and it was justified in doing so. It has a hard time coming out and saying it too openly, but essentially the willingness of American governments and other Western governments to forgive Israeli proliferation is based on this other norm. I'll give you another example. If you look at Crimea and the Western response to the Russian violation of the territorial integrity norm vis-a-vis Ukraine, why has the response been so restrained? Well, so there's one answer, which is realpolitik. Russia provides so much energy to Europe. Europe and Germany in particular has so many financial interests at stake. For sure. There is a second reason.
Not so much, by the way.
Well, so I think
when you look at the numbers, Germany's.
I think that there's a second reason, which is one of the reasons why the world has been very slow to be very critical, and that is because there's another norm at stake, and that's a norm of self-determination, and that even the strongest critics of what's been happening say, well, okay, but we do know that most people in Crimea really, really didn't want to be part of the Ukraine anymore. They had tried to leave before. This is a long-standing thing. And the right of self-determination is yet another norm. So in other words, when can norm violations be forgiven? When there's a competing norm that can be on a similar level. And those are two examples. Let me just hit one other thing, and that is this question of how do we parse out differences between realpolitik interests and norms? And I think it's been said, it's been said to a certain extent, just to part of the problem we have in talking about norms is we equate norms with internalization of norms, and that's not true. Mm-hmm. Norms, like running red lights or violating speed limits, it's a norm. Some of us have large opportunity costs, what we'd say, to violate that norm, but refrain from doing so otherwise. To a certain extent, yes, we've internalized it, but to another extent, it's because there's that third-party enforcement out there, right? It's still a norm, and I don't violate it because of that third-party enforcement. Yeah. And with Syria, if it was really just all about realpolitik, for instance, then if the United States wanted to strike Syria, it would have done it. Chemical weapons use would have been a non-factor. If it didn't want to strike Syria, chemical weapons use would have been a non-factor. The point of chemical weapons use here, and the reason why we know it's not just realpolitik, is because it was an issue, right? The threat of force was specifically connected to the violation of a normative idea.
Thank you. Bruno, you wanted to respond to
no, it's
what
not so
you
much
just
responding.
said?
I would say, look, I'm improvising here, but I suspect that when there's a norm, be it in the psychological domain or in the international life, you can have, when you're faced with a norm, you can have three different attitudes. One, I don't violate the norm because it's a norm. Two, I don't violate the norm because it's enforced and I make a rational calculation. Three, I violate the norm because it's a norm. We haven't talked about transgression.
Yeah.
Transgression, in behavioral politics is something that has to be put to the mix. It's a bit late in the debate to put it in the mix, but the question of transgression is something in a longer debate that I think should be brought into the mix. With due respect, I think you should add one reason to, if you want to discuss the U.S. attitude towards Israel, you said that's because, Israel has certain sympathy for the dangers faced, but there's another reason. I would argue it's also opacity. Opacity.
Opacity, yeah.
Opacity.
Okay.
Opacity. No, I mean...
You should hear my accent in French, it's even better.
That's right. So I think it's very difficult to not take that into account, including because a norm debate is also a quote moral debate, etc. And anyway, I don't need to go further. By the way, I was still thinking about Tlatelolco meanwhile, and I think in a longer debate about Tlatelolco, I would be tempted to say that maybe Tlatelolco was an exception because it was essentially a bilateral process, contrary to the other nuclear weapons-free zone. I mean, I would. Without having really thought about it, I would be tempted to make that an argument subject to discussion.
The universalization of Tlatelolco. Yeah. But two quick points. One, the dynamic between taboo and transgression, because of course there can be a taboo if there is no transgression and vice versa. So I think this is very interesting, and history doesn't teach us clear lessons. Hitler wouldn't use chemical weapons at war.
On the battlefield?
On the battlefield, yeah.
He used them. Just not on the battlefield.
Materials.
At war.
Well, yeah. But that's my point.
Yeah.
He used them.
No, but
Is this a question of accent?
This debate is when everyone was under readiness that Bruno was mentioning during World War II was there. I mean, the American army was moving with a stockpile of chemical weapons 20 kilometers behind in the event of something like that. So So that was it's an interesting case. The second thing is dates matter, and there we have, this is where the connection with the treaty and the norm are interesting, because the norm sometimes crystallizes with the treaty. For instance, if you take nuclear proliferation, we didn't call, or I mean, I've studied the moment where the world proliferation starts making its way in our business. It's pretty late, in fact.
When is it?
Early 60s. You don't find any official document that refers to that until the early 60s. We're talking about dissemination of technology, and when proliferation comes in, it's a mix of horizontal and vertical for a long time, and so on. And that's one of the reasons the NPT was called the NPT. But dates matter. For instance, if you take nuclear testing, for a certain period of time, it's not really a problem to test nuclear weapons. Then, for a certain period of time, it's not a problem if you test them underground. And then it becomes, and then now the taboo is pretty strong. And whenever the North Koreans do the translation of testing, everyone's very upset, and even their closest friends need to do something about it. And that explains the forgiveness. Of course, seen from the U.S., France was a proliferator, but we did proliferate before the norm was crystallized, and to a certain extent, this is true of Israel and India, in many ways. There are some colleagues in France who argue that Israel could have argued to be under NPT rules, but finally. When France did proliferate successfully, or one could argue, there were plenty of others who were considering it, including countries that are now have taken a different path. Sweden, very, very bad guys like Sweden, Switzerland, Canada, Australia, Germany, and all of that. So it was a completely different moment. And I think from that perspective, it's interesting because there is a moment, where, and it's difficult to predict, where it becomes impossible without a massive transgression. And that's an interesting moment. Basically, why did the North Koreans never sign the NPT in the first place? That's not coherent. But at a certain point, the Soviet Union exerted enough pressure on them so that they would feel compelled to abide the norm, even the North Koreans. Because in theory they should have been together with the other non-signatories if you look at their mindset. But the crystallization had taken place when they were there.
They didn't take it too seriously.
And then they violated it. But they put themselves in a situation of transgression.
They love transgression.
They love transgression.
I mean, in the 60s, a nuclear test never made headline. And the North Koreans have been, over the past few weeks, they know that even before doing a test, they already have New York Times headlines before making a test. It's fantastic if you're North Korean, I can push the button, and it's that sense of transgression. I don't know what makes, Kim Jong-un tick, but
Reading
certainly...
Seeing his name in the New
I
York
don't
Times.
want to know, by the way.
It's like
I don't want to know.
It's like a teenager on drugs,
Yeah, it's a little bit like that. Again, that's the question of the appeal of transgression is, I think, something you have to take into account in our discussion.
Yeah, we will do
so
that.
We need to lash on the North Koreans.
Thank you, Camille, for concluding this debate. Thank you all for everything you said, and what's left to think about and to talk about. I think there's much. Thank you for being with us. We are right on time. Bon voyage. Thank you.
Thank you.